Namaste, I'm Umang from Mumbai Tarun Bharat and Policy Advocacy Research Centre, and you are watching Bharatasya Sangeet Vishwanubandh Yatra. It is an attempt to trace the journey of Indian classical music and instruments in interrelationship with world music cultures. Today, we have with us Mr. Justin Scarimbolo. Justin is a classical guitarist, a Hindustani sitarist, and a ethnomusicologist based in Pune. Originally from the small hamlet of Kenoza Lake in New York State, Justin came to Pune for a student exchange program in 1996. After he completed his education, he decided to settle down in India for both professional and personal reasons. Currently, as an active musician and a music teacher over the years, Justin has also carried out research and written dissertations regarding music. Welcome, Justin ji. Welcome to our Yatra.
Thank you so much, Ma. Namaste.
So let me begin by asking you, when was the first time that you came across Indian classical music? And what was it that you decided to go for this student exchange program in India?
Okay, I'll try to be brief. If I imagine it's actually, I'm not exactly sure what my first exposure was to Indian classical music, but in my imagination, it was when I was quite young and I was listening to my parents play music on their record player, and the Beatles were the first sort of introduction to the sound of a sitar for me. But it wasn't until much later, I'd say in high school. Yeah.
Was it the Norwegian wood?
It might have been. It's a bit fuzzy, but I mean, since then I've come to mine the music of the Beatles for more Indian influences. So I'm aware, of other songs too that have a strong influence. Perhaps the most influential for Indian music being "Within You, Without You," I would say. But it wasn't until later in high school that someone introduced me. I think my high school band teacher, to this album by the group Shakti, which was a sort of a fusion project with John McLaughlin on guitar and Zakir Hussain on drums and L. Shankar on the violin. So you had, Hindustani, Carnatic, jazz, all kind of wound together in this interesting, very fiery, improvisatory music, and that was very inspiring for me. And I think that led to me just further looking into Indian classical music. And then later in college, I was exposed to more traditional Indian classical music through some coursework I had been doing, specifically a world music class that surveys different traditional musics from around the world, India being one of them. And so, then I don't know how detailed you'd like me to go, but I decided to apply while I was in college for a sort of a research fellowship that would allow me to come. It was loosely framed about going to at the time they used the word, unfortunate word, third world country, to do a project of my own devise. And so I wrote up a project about Indian classical music, and I happened to have the good fortune to receive that fellowship, and then also, more importantly, to get connected with someone named Alan Miner, Dr. Alan Miner, who is a scholar of Sanskrit and is also a performer of Indian classical music, Sitar, who's based at the University of Pennsylvania. And this was before, the internet became what it is today. And so a lot of our conversations were on the phone. She introduced me to my teacher ultimately in Pune, but many other musicians. And I guess from there, it just became more and more in depth. But that's how I got to Indian classical music. It's not exactly, doesn't exactly explain why I came to Indian classical music, but that's maybe another question.
True. Yes. So I at least got to know how did you get in touch with it and what made you pursue it. So now let me ask you, did this pursuit of Indian classical music change something within you?
Okay, well, I guess to know that, I mean, it's helpful to know why I went there to begin with. So I had been studying Western classical music, and Western classical music is traditionally written down and then by a composer, and then read and interpreted by a performer. And those roles are, while they're oftentimes combined in one person, more often they're separated, and so there's a sort of a division of labor, I guess you could say. I was interested in improvisation more, and jazz, which is the other sort of logical alternative to move to for improvisatory music. I don't know. I mean, while I tried, I found it a bit too intellectual. That's not to say that I didn't find Indian music intellectual, but I found it too focused on tonal theory and chord changes and all that stuff, and it didn't. I don't know. It found difficult to relate to. But with Indian classical music, and it was probably the fact that I didn't know anything about it or very little about it. I felt I could connect to it more, but the fact that it had a fixed tonic and that it was melody focused, or at least I thought it was,
Right.
that really pulled me in. So it did change, but of course, I mean, getting into it, it changed my musical understanding. And I guess your question was more about as a person, or more broadly. I don't know. I mean, perhaps it made me a little more patient because it's been an incredibly difficult and long road, and that requires a sort of sadhana, I guess you would say.
Right.
So in that sense, it may have encouraged those qualities within me. Yeah.
So you say the melody is what attracted to you, and it took you more towards Indian classical music. Now I want to ask you that how was the theory part of Indian classical music, and how did you study it?
Yeah, theory was a little bit more of a complex subject to get in touch with. I think early on I was exposed to some, I mean, my language skills were quite limited early on, so I didn't have access to, some of the Indian musicological works, like the works of Vishnu Narayan Bhatkhande, whose works was first in Marathi and later in Hindi, and still really not in English, except for one very recently. What the first volume has been translated, and others. But so I guess I was exposed to more general types of theoretical works, introductions of that sort. But yes, later on, I did get into some of the Indian musicological works. And then, of course, when Indian music theory is discussed, it's often related to the Sanskrit literature, just the Shastras, and all the way back to, of course, Bharata's text. So I did explore those works, but also not directly in the language of their, their original languages.
Right.
And amongst musicians, I find generally there to be less emphasis on theory as compared in Western classical music, except for, of course, I don't know. It seems perhaps that the theory is a bit more practical, you might say, with Indian music, if I'm so bold as to say so.
Okay. And while you studied your theory based on Indian texts, and you got to know more and more about the theory part, I would want to ask you, you started off learning music as a Western classical guitarist, if I am understanding right.
Correct.
So I want to ask you, how would you describe your transition from a classical guitarist or a guitar player to a sitar player? I see both are plucking instruments, both have frets, but there is quite a lot of difference. So could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure. Well, in the technical aspects, the mechanical aspects, I guess you might say, of actually playing an instrument with your hands, the transition was not so difficult. So especially coming from Western classical guitar, in which you utilize all, I guess these four main fingers, not the pinky. So they're also working as their own type of mizrab or plectrum. And so you're using them all independently. And then there's a lot of facility, a lot of attention given to the cultivating independence of all of these fingers too, moving separately and playing different voices at the same time. So in some senses, the technical requirements of classical guitar were a bit more so, or a bit harder in some ways than the sitar. But the sitar has its own challenges, of course. And whereas guitar, you're playing across the strings this way as well as this way. With sitar, you're playing mostly laterally this way. So the main melody string, most of the melodies played on one string, and so you have to approach it this way, but you also pull the string. The pulling technique that's probably been the hardest to master. I don't think I have necessarily mastered it. But beyond technical things, I think the biggest challenge in the transition was the music, of course. And it's, I don't think it'll ever be something I'm not striving to learn. I mean, that comes easily in that sense.
True.
I'd also like to point out that another sort of difficulty that I had in coming from learning guitar to learning sitar is that the method of teaching. With my while I was in college studying classical guitar, I would meet with my guitar teacher for a half an hour once a week. And during that half an hour, he would give me all kinds of feedback related to my performance, and I would write things down in my notebook, and then I would go away and I would practice in my solitary practice room for 3 to 4 hours a day. And then I would come back for that next half an hour lesson in the week, and we would do it all over again. It's virtually been the opposite for me in learning Sitar, where a lot of the practice has happened in front of my teacher. And I found that very difficult because I was used to kind of honing something privately and to work out something that I'm not even sure of how to do in front of my teacher was just very embarrassing, I guess you could say, and difficult.
Maybe the initial few days, the nascent days, would have been so.
Yeah, it's certainly in the beginning, but even now, I do feel a little bit, shy to play in front of my teacher. So
you started learning the sitar, and
Yes.
parallelly you started your study of musicology. I'd like to know more about the study of ethnomusicology and the scope of it, and what is it that you've studied?
Sure. I don't. My proclivity is to give you sort of a lecture about the history of the field, but I really don't think that would be in anyone's interest right now. But I would say that I guess, to put a small hat on it, ethnomusicology it's not a musical. In some ways, the focus is not music. The focus is broader questions related to history, society, culture, power, race, class, gender, globalization, all of these issues that animate the academy more broadly speaking, and other disciplines. Ethnomusicologists tend to be, it's not universal, of course, and it's changed throughout history, but ethnomusicologists tend to be focused on those things through using music as a window to look upon those issues. At the same time, a lot of the background that ethnomusicologists have before coming into the field is a practical sort of music background. And of course, that's, again, not universal. There are a lot of differences and changes over time with where people have sort of the backgrounds that scholars have had. But go ahead, please.
Because music was always surrounded by patronage and by various societal reforms or societal conditions of the artist, of the patrons, or the overall reasons of that art being developed. They're so vast and wide, and I mean, while studying music, one also has to look at all the things that you have studied. Yes, so
I'm not so sure. We need to.
In terms of knowing more about the subject, knowing deeper about the subject, not as a performing artist, learning music as a performing artist, and learning about music as a subject is what is what I'm talking.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I think there's a tendency, pretty much in most places. I mean, not just in India, but to see music as something that's maybe a little bit divorced from the problems of society, as sort of a refuge, if you might say, but I think that ethnomusicologists really want to put the society back into music, to see it as a form of being social, being human, being cultural. And so, yeah, I think as a subject, it's important to look at music like that. As a performing art, of course, it's a different story.
Right.
So I don't, with my sort of PhD work, I was looking, I mean, actually my sort of excuse for getting into ethnomusicology to begin with was, I thought I misunderstood it being sort of perhaps a more responsible career path than being a musician, but as a way to stay involved with music. And so I think one of the reasons I chose my PhD subject within ethnomusicology was so that I could remain close to my teacher and her family. So I found, as I learned with my teacher, and I learned more about the history of her family. So my teacher, she's based in Pune. Her name is Jyoti Thakkar. Before marriage, she was Ashtewale, and she comes from a Maharashtrian family that I guess traces their roots back to Ujjain. And before that, a small place called Ashta, that's somewhere between Bhopal and maybe Indore in the Malwa region. And before that, it's unclear where her family originated from, but probably closer to what is now Maharashtra, I think.
Right.
Her family, the more I found out about the history of her family and the way they got into music and when they got into music, I found that it really pushed up against a lot of the narratives that had sort of been developed within at least the Western Academy regarding Indian music and how and it's the changes that have happened over the past 200 years or so in the population of performers, and how this was all sort of happening in the context of late period colonialism and nationalism and the shift towards independence. And so basically the short story of it is that my teacher's family came into music sort of early on, before a lot of these changes and pushes towards musical reform and social reform came in the later 19th century. And they were patrons at the time, and but also disciples of the very musicians they patronized. And later on, as the family sort of grew and the wealth of the family sort of got divided and sort of diluted, I guess you could say, music became sort of a source for a career. And so my teacher's father was a teacher of Sitar and music in Bhopal, in a school that was sort of famous for arts and music. And my teacher herself has been studying sitar her whole life and giving performances, but she has had to sort of balance that with her role as a mother and a wife. And so she's had an interesting career trajectory herself. So my dissertation focused on the history of her family and how they came to music, but seeing that in connection with the history of other Maharashtrian Brahmins who came to classical music over the 19th century and 20th century.
Also, when we talk about ethnomusicology, we talk about societies, we talk about people, we talk about music. Something that happens with music outside also happens within. So, Indian classical music provides the ability to emote various human expressions through music. What is your take on that?
Ah, okay. That's a little bit of a tough question for an ethnomusicologist to answer, perhaps. Um, I mean, it seems to me that any music can offer that same ability for expression. Um, I think the interesting thing about music, or one of the interesting things, is that what the performer is expressing, whether they intend it or not, might not be the same thing that the listener is interpreting or receiving. Um, so I think one useful thing that I've found from my study of Western classical music is that when you're performing something, that you hold something in your imagination um, about what it could be, an image, it could be a feeling, it could be a word, it could be something that will help you sort of um, generate the kind of expression that you want to express. And I think with Indian classical music, it's for those who have been acculturated to it and are part of the world of Indian classical music. There's some understanding, shared understanding about the kind of emotion that certain ragas are supposed to evoke, for example. So that's a very sort of interesting difference with Western classical music. I don't think, although there are some kind of general things in Western classical music too. If you know, play a major chord versus a minor chord, there's a certain understanding of, happy, sad kind of thing happening. But I think the fact that Indian music has these established, that raga has established sort of notions of a kind of emotion that should be expressed with that raga, I think that that's helpful as a performer to help bring that across and to help focus your intentions. So I don't know, does that answer your question a little bit?
I want to move further to ask you, as a performer, since we're talking about performances and ragas, as a performer, which is your most played raga, and what do you think that raga has given you?
So there are some different schools of thought when it comes to learning Indian music, and I'm on a number of different aspects of it. But one thing is there are some traditions or people who suggest that when you're learning music, you should really focus on one rag for a long time. There's a lot of stories of people learning rag Yaman, for example, for like years before moving on to any other kind of raga. And then there are others who think that, and I think with good reason also, that this raga system is inherently intertextual, so or intermelodic. So what makes one raga unique is kind of what differentiates it from another raga. So you have to know kind of that raga in order to play this raga. So you don't play that raga and you're kind of separating everything out and making the raga pure. And in that sense, it's helpful to be familiar with the breath instead of going deep into one. And I don't think there's any one, correct way in that sense. I think both of them are probably required. I think I have tended to, based on my teacher's proclivities and my own, focus on specific rags, and so I, as a result, I don't have a large breadth of knowledge of how to play a large scope of ragas. So yeah, in the beginning, I did focus on Yaman for a long time.
Okay.
And I guess a lot of the sort of common big ragas like Malkons, Bhageshri. Right now, for many months, I've only been working on Bihag. And for me and where I'm at in my stage of development, it's been very helpful to do that, because after sort of really getting a sense of the rag, it's what that allows for, or that's allowed me to do, is focus on how I treat the different aspects of the development of the rag, whether it be alap, jor, jala, different aspects of Vilambit Gat, Rud Gat. Right. So in a sense, those things have been more the focus than the rag. But there's just never enough time to do everything.
True. I would like to further go on asking you, as a performer playing these ragas in front of the audience, and we spoke about how the practitioner or the artist playing the instrument also has a certain set of emotions which he is playing with. Then the rag also has certain set of emotions, or we've created something around that, and what people perceive as an emotion that is invoked within them when they listen to a specific rag. I want to ask you, how does the non-Indian audience, or the American audience, or wherever you've performed across the globe, how does the global audience react to this take on Indian classical music?
Well, I can answer more from the perspective of an audience member than a performer, because I don't have a vast experience in live performance. Not as much as I have in actually being an audience member, but I have attended concerts in I guess largely in different American cities, a little bit in let's see, where would it have been in Europe? I'm not sure if I've actually attended. Oh, yeah, maybe in the Netherlands. As I sort of was saying at the outset, one of the things that attracted me to Indian music was I was sort of felt like I could relate to it a little bit more than jazz, because of its fixed tonal center and its focus on melody. And but I also think that my feeling that I could relate to it better was also because I didn't know much about it, and so that sort of allowed me room to invent whatever I wanted to and about meaning. So I think I've been to concerts where the audience, if it's primarily a foreign audience, or an audience that's at least not acculturated to to raga music, there's complete silence throughout the entire performance. And so you don't get any of that, wah, kya baat hai, or you don't get any of that interaction with the audience, right? But I've heard performers talk about this, and I've heard them talk about it in sort of celebratory ways, in the sense like, yes, it was so amazing. Everyone was so silent and they gave their full attention, and it was like a reverence in that sense towards the music. Perhaps, though, they're comparing it to playing for audiences that maybe aren't paying attention at all, or maybe talking during a performance. I was at one of these not so recent, not recently, where the people sitting next to me were talking about something completely unrelated to the performance that was going on, and it was very distracting. And but I would imagine, as an Indian musician, one would prefer not only focus of the audience, but engagement of the audience, and to know how their music is affecting their audience. And then there's a sort of reciprocal back and forth in terms of responses. So that's not something you get with an audience that's not used to raga music.
Right.
And I think you also get, so the general arc of Indian music in terms of the progression of performance tends to be sort of climactic, right? So you start slow, and you build this large edifice that incorporates rhythm, and then gets faster, and ends in a kind of climax. Of course, that's a big generalization, but so I think that excites people who are not used to hearing that. They can sort of relate to that aspect of it, and they can hook in to the performance. And but I've seen people perhaps go a little bit or do things that might be considered a little bit blasphemous in the traditional context, where they're kind of like dancing maybe, or allowing the music to move their body in certain ways, which is not something that you generally see in a traditional Baitak or Indian music classical concert.
Correct. Right. Wow. Thank you. That was a very insightful take into the subject. I would like to now know, as audience, that you say that you've had a great experience being an audience more than a performer, but you've also studied the art, you've studied the theory, you've studied the background. I would like to ask you, with respect to sitar, how has this instrument changed over years?
I think the one thing that we should all understand about the sitar is that it's really, well, it's like any instrument in that it doesn't have a single origin story. And in that sense, it's like any music, or like pretty much anything on the planet. I mean, where sort of everything is coming together from different sources. So the sitar, while it may have many sort of sources of input, the two main ones, I would say, are the Persian Sitar, which of course shares a similar name with sitar, and the Rudra Veena, which is more of a indigenous instrument to India. So both of them, the Sitar and the Rudra Veena, are very different types of instruments. The sitar is very small. It has a very thin, and even historically, I mean, I'm talking about the sitar now, but there's been changes in that instrument over hundreds of years too. So it's got a very thin neck, not with metal frets like a sitar, but with just gut frets, tied frets, and a limited number of strings. It's no capacity for pulling meaned or anything like that. So some of those aspects, like the ability to play portamento, you would say in Western classical music, or slides or meaned, is something that the sitar adopted from the Rudravina. And some of the other aspects, perhaps most importantly, being the bridge that the strings go over on the sitar, which is it's called the Giovanni Bridge, and you can see, let's see, which is this piece. So this is actually one of the most interesting things that comes out, I think, or maybe perhaps unique things about Indian music in the world, is this, you might call it in English a buzz bridge, or a bridge that deliberately does not stop the string at a very particular point, like a violin would or a guitar would, and instead purposely allows the string to incorporate this controlled distortions, you might say, as it vibrates against a larger stretch of the bridge. And that's what contributes to the sitar's unique sound, and to other instruments, Indian instruments that use that bridge. So that's something that developed from the Rudravina also. And then sometimes you see on a sitar, in addition to the lower gourd that your right arm rests upon, sometimes there's a gourd that's attached to the upper part of the instrument. And this one can accept one, but I've removed it. That I would say is probably less functional and more stylistic, and an attempt to conjure, or sort of the image of the Rudravina, which is made of two large pumpkins on each side of a hollow piece of bamboo. So other than the ability to play meaned and the incorporation of the buzzing bridge, the Jawadi, and the raised, I didn't talk about the fact that the sitar has raised frets also. So unlike the setar, which has just gut frets tied around the fret or the neck, the sitar has raised frets, and that allow you to push the main string over and sort of help the main string glide across, so you can actually pull the mean. But the early sitars, so I think it's the first actual historical evidence that we have for something called the sitar is textual. It's a reference, the use of the word sitar from, I'm not exactly, I can get back to you on the exact date, but my guess is the 1770s. And I think the reference is into something, an instrument in the context of Jaipur. The idea that the sitar itself is goes back to Amir Khusro, which is a common belief, doesn't seem to be historically evidential. But people have traced that very idea through certain narratives over time. So I think it can be traced back to where that idea sort of developed. But it was, again, that was something that happened in the 19th century, the first sort of claim that the sitar developed with Amir Khusro. So the sitar in that sense is you would say, early modern instrument, perhaps. And its early form was much smaller than the sitar we have today. It didn't have the capacity to pull meaned to the degree that we have today. Some of the, and it was also much, it's not actually, even today, it's not, the construction and the number of strings is not completely standardized. There are options available to people today, but I think in the past it was even much more sort of, fluid. One thing that also developed later on the sitar was the incorporation of sympathetic strings. So you can see, in addition to the bridge with the main strings here, there's a secondary bridge here that holds a whole nother set of strings. And these strings are tuned to the raga that you're playing. You don't actually play them with your fingers during performance, but they ring out in sympathy compared to the notes you're playing on top. So that's why in English, they're called sympathetic strings. In Hindi, they're called taraf strings, which that word taraf may go back to this idea of in Arabic music, the sort of response that an audience member gives in a performance. So the performance is performer is playing something, and the audience member says something like "Kya baat hai?" That's a sympathetic vibration that's happening from the audience. So like that, these strings are kind of your audience members, and they're speaking back to you as you're playing on the main strings. So that was also a later development with the sitar.
So they create a sound using resonance.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
So earlier,
sympathetic vibration. Yeah.
While earlier in the day, these strings were not a part of this sitar, and eventually added further. I see.
Right.
Okay. So there's been a lot of influence of various kinds on Indian music. And Indian music in itself, Indian classical music now has gathered great attention all over the world. So I want to ask you, how do you see the impact of Indian culture on world music?
Well, that's that's a big question. So one thing that came to mind, when I first heard that question was, it's easier to kind of, I guess, consider the impact that Indian music had on world music and world culture in the mid or 60s and late 60s when like I said, with the Beatles and all of the sort of influence that Indian music had, but we can look back much further. One example that I thought of was, so in the mid and late 19th century, there was one of the early, musicologists of Indian music, Surendra Mohan Tagore, a Bengali who was also of a patronage class. He studied Indian music and is I think even today considered the most published more works on Indian music than anyone has throughout Indian music history. He had sent all over the world his publications as well as Indian musical instruments. He had shipped all over the world to various museums and academic societies. And it was his work and his instruments that influenced some of the earliest theorists in Europe to develop this system of instrument classification that became known as the study of organology, or the study of musical instruments. So, of course, a lot of Surendra Mohan Tagore's ideas about the typology of instruments and the classification was influenced by older Shastric knowledge as well. So it's interesting to know that, and I was quite surprised when I came to learn that this system of instrument classification that had been, developed in the West, and that had been used throughout the 19th and early 20th century, was actually something that was influenced by Indian music. So one small example. There are many, many others.
Right. Now, we've had a very nice discussion, and you've told us your insights and a lot of knowledge sharing that you've done regarding Sitar, the study of ethnomusicology. So, ladies and gentlemen, that was Mr. Justin Scarimbolo, ethnomusicologist, classical guitarist, and a sitar player. He shared his insights and knowledge about Indian classical music and its impact on world music cultures. Thank you so much, Justin Ji, for being a part of our Bharatasya Sangeet Vishwanubandh Yatra.
You're most welcome, Amang.